Welcome to the Unit 102-085, Aboriginal Culturally Responsive Pedagogies, Q4 2021. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge country. Today I'm recording this lecture on Darug land, but of course acknowledgement to country is a very important part of what we do in schools. And it's important to recognise that all of you are able to acknowledge country. It's only those schools that have an appropriate elder who can do welcome to country, and that is specifically an elder from that particular school region. So, for example, a Darug person doing it on Darug lands. So today I'd like to acknowledge country out of recognition of all the campuses that our schools occupy. I'd also like to acknowledge the pedagogical, and that's the place that means where the eels lie down to breed, particularly in the Parramatta River. I'd also like to acknowledge our Gundungurra and our Dharawal peoples, which our other campuses are located. We also have campuses now on Wiradjuri and other Aboriginal nations, and I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who have come to help us in this unit and to learn both ways. In this unit, I will be your lecturer and your tutor. My name is Shirley Gilbert. My office is in K224A. Of course, that's not going to be of any use to you in COVID times, and we will have regular guest appearances in our tutorials from elders such as Auntie Jean South, who is our elder in residence at Western Sydney, Annie Daly, and some other non-Indigenous teachers who are working proactively in our school settings, who'll come in and help us understand what's going on in Aboriginal education in the real. So my name's Shirley Gilbert, as I've already said. I'm a Gunditjmara woman. I'm a lecturer in the School of Education. I've had a lot of experience in Aboriginal education for over 25 years. I've worked for the Board of Studies. Previously, it was the name for NESA. I've worked for the Department of Ag. I've worked for the Department of Education. I've worked for TAFE. Currently working and sharing knowledge with Jarara, which is the Catholic Education Office, and work with New South Wales DET at Brawongal. I've worked with National Parks, and I'm a director of Marama. So I've had lots of experiences on lots of Aboriginal programs, lots of Aboriginal curriculum development, and hopefully in this unit you will be able to explore some of those through questioning of myself, but also of Auntie Jean and others who come to the classroom. Just a little bit more about myself as a Gunditjmara woman. My totem is the black cockatoo, and particularly I am Gabbage. And of course, in most communities, there are two moieties, totemic moieties, and I'm Gabbage, so I get half of that information. And Gurridge is the sulphur-crested cockatoo. Of course, there are other moieties within each of those clan groups, 7 or 8 usually. Things that are often totems are emu, boa snake, pelican, crow, bat. Here in Western Sydney, also kangaroo and others become part of those totemic responsibilities. And there are other totemic responsibilities attached to marriage and totems and guiding of bloodlines within language groups, many of which have been lost per se in New South Wales because of colonisation, invasion. and other historical acts that we will investigate next week. Just to give you some idea of where my community is, it's down here where salt water meets fresh water. I think that's partly why I enjoy working also on direct lands, because it's also an area where salt water meets fresh water and where the eels are. And our community also is very strong in stories around eels, but also in terms of it is a major food source. So now we're going to move on to why 102085 was developed. For most of you, you've heard of at least the professional standards and the cross-curriculum priority areas. It, of course, was developed out of some of those initiatives, but these initiatives have been around for several decades. However, in more recent times, since 2011 and the AITSL formation and ACARA national curriculum, we see a very much more formalised version of what is going on in terms of professional standards 1.4 and 2.4, and of course the cross-curriculum priority areas, particularly that one, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and languages. There was also a significant recognition that in Australia, although we've had 30 years or more of strategies and policy making to try to close the educational gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, that these gaps are not improving in many instances. And so one of the ways in which government policy hopes to seek some restitution in that area and some improvement in that area is through teacher training. So some of the things that you might investigate a little bit further, depending on the angles you take on your first paper, is looking at the historical development of what we call the More Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander initiative, which was to put numbers of Aboriginal students through education processes and then hopefully have 1,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers by the year 1999. Unfortunately, those realisations were never met. In more recent years, we've developed the Australian Lecturers in Initial Teacher Education, and that occurred in 2016, and I am the current president of that group. So we have 43 higher education universities around the country who have accredited teacher education programs, but unfortunately we only have about 17 lecturers teaching into those programs. So there's a significant gap there in terms of employment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lecturers. And next week we'll talk about some of those reasonings. And then, you know, some of the other things that came out of that initial agitation, if you like, was the need for teachers to be supported in ways that they could access information 24/7, because Aboriginal education and resources are often scattered throughout libraries, scattered throughout websites. So as part of Aletia's first challenge after the Matt Seedy report was to create the 3Rs website, and that web address is at the end of the presentation. So what's this unit about? Primarily it's about how do I give you enough information and enough skills and enough pedagogical approaches so that you can meet your graduate requirements in terms of focus area 1.4.1. And that means that you have to provide opportunities for students to develop understanding and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders histories, cultures and languages, and that will be something that you will be doing on practicums. The other area is, of course, standard 2.4.1, where you have to demonstrate broad knowledge and understanding of the impact of culture, cultural identity, linguistic background on the education of students from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. So in that part of that is what we will be doing in tutorials, but also part of what you will be doing in terms of your own professional learning as you work through all of the materials perhaps that are offered to you on the View site. When we look at professional standards, we need to look at the graduate level and then perhaps the proficient level. So at graduate level, we only have to demonstrate broad knowledge and understanding. But as we move into the profession and once you become employed, you have to show evidence of how you're providing opportunities to develop understanding. So hopefully this unit gives you more than a graduate level and definitely towards proficient levels before you leave the profession. And there's a reason for that, is that in Western Sydney we have the highest numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in our classrooms. So one of the other changes that happened very quickly in 2018, however, Western Sydney secondary programs had already actively engaged in 2015 to ask myself to make a program that was going to meet those professional requirements. But now all teaching programs from all universities have to have a standalone, and by that I mean a single unit that teaches you about Aboriginal education, the priority areas and the content, and how you're going to create very useful, often land-based education experiences for your students. But it's also about giving you the pedagogical understandings as well, things like what constitutes racism and anti-racism. However, many of you will have done that in your inclusive education units, what it means to be and act in culturally appropriate ways, and how do we work with communities. They're all things that we will touch upon in this particular area, in this particular unit. And other things that we will look at is, what do you need professionally as a graduate to improve your understanding of Aboriginal education. In this unit, of course, we're going to have lots of active discussion. It is going to be online. There is going to be the use of breakout rooms on Zoom. But some of the discussions will be about improving literacy, improving engagement. How do we stop the perpetuation of Aboriginal mythology and stereotypes in our classrooms? What are the sorts of things that make us more culturally aware? But how do we then move into an actual area of cultural responsiveness and cultural responsive praxis? Other things that I want you to explore in this unit are what kind of teaching philosophy, particularly in this area and particularly in Western Sydney, are you going to frame yourself around? What are the sorts of attributes that you think are going to be useful as you look at, for example, the boomerang here on the right-hand side, where we've got many of you coming with lots of non-Aboriginal curriculum knowledge, non-Aboriginal well-being knowledge, all of those diversity and difference information, and you're hoping that this unit provides you with all the Aboriginal knowledge. And then once we move into a more balanced area of that knowledge, we move up into the common ground and where we can get innovation in our lesson plans. But that area is called the cultural interface. And how do we develop our own cultural interfaces within our curriculum areas, and what are the sorts of things we're required to professionally undertake to get to those positions, and are you able to enhance your practices by undertaking and embracing Aboriginal ways of knowing and doing Aboriginal education. So one of the things I'm going to ask you in this particular unit, because we're running online and Auntie Jean and others might come into the room at different times in our tutorials, is make sure you have your mobile phones turned off, of course, unless you're using your mobile phone to zoom in on. Make sure that you've got a place where your external background sounds are at a minimum. Turn on your cameras on your computer, especially when elders and community are in the room. They don't necessarily always understand the technology, but they perhaps read us by our engagement through visual, and always demonstrate respect. And by that I mean calling Auntie Jean. Auntie Jean is part of what she would like us to do. One of the other large concepts here is the concept of deep listening, and we of course have a word for it, but this unit has lots of narratives. And if communities keep repeating the narrative, it generally means that most of the group, most of the cohort, have not yet understood the deep message you need to understand about this unit and what your responsibilities are to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners, but more importantly to the broader Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The complexities of Aboriginal education and this particular unit. It's going to be, for many of you, a little bit uncomfortable. It's about unlearning some of what you think you've already learnt. It's about learning about your own privilege and understanding as a teacher, but also as a learner in this group. But it's also about creating more creative teachers. Hopefully I will be able to give you a number of experiences in pedagogy, making you a more dynamic teacher for all kinds of learners, but especially those of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage, but also understanding new teaching pedagogical approaches, such as using land-based education, using 8 ways, using storytelling, using Didiri or deep listening and yarning to support student well-being, and how you will use those effectively in a range of classes. So the concept of living, and this one is according to Deborah Bird Rose, is the concept of a living world depends on communication. It requires that one listen as well as speak. It requires an attitude of attentiveness and a degree of respect. I would say that the concept of a truly living world requires a shift in thinking for many settlers. And so what Deborah Bird Rose is trying to communicate to us is that lots of us don't actually listen to what is being conveyed to our non-Indigenous teachers, parents, communities, etc., about what it is our Aboriginal kids require. Okay, some of the comments about this unit from previous students. And without apology, I'm putting these up just to flag what will be some of the challenges for some of you in COVID, that there's too much reading, that there's too much work, and there's too many stories and talking from the lecturer and oral histories on views sites for us to look at. But what I want you to think about is, are you really listening? And what are you going to be able to demonstrate in terms of 1.4 and 2.4, but many other professional standards once you're on practicums, that can be really beneficial to your practice. Now I want to raise some of the things about the too much reading and why perhaps there might be too much reading. And much of that comes into play when we think about our own history of what we were supposed to have learnt as primary school students, as high school students, and even as undergraduates, and what we've actually taken away and how we're going to unlearn some of that, or in many instances, relearn what we should have learnt the first time. So this is just two curriculums from primary. This is history and geography, and as you can see, there are many instances where in primary school here across Australia, all students should have had expectations of learning about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' histories, cultures, and practices. So if we look at year 4, of course, we look at journeys of exploration. We're looking at what was life like for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which we'll look at next week. So I'm really going to be reviewing quite a bit of what we should have already learnt in our primary school experiences. And I'm apologising in the first instance to our international students, but there will be many things on the View site which will help you catch up, if you like, around some of these voids in your own understanding of Australian history. In geography, again, many people have absolutely limited memory of what they did in relation to Aboriginal geography, but even primary geography. But these were all very linear models of a curriculum, and they were outlined, and many of you have missed significant parts of this just history and geography, and we're not talking about English, maths, science, or any of the others in primary, where they all had experiences of you engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content. What I suspect happened for many of you is that it was mostly stereotypical and repetitive, and many of you have significant perhaps resentment, if you like, around this. So now I'm going to move on to just a couple of examples from high school. And in high school, all people who did high school within the last, well, these syllabuses have been rolling on for some time now. So I'm going to say for the last 20 years of my work, many syllabuses have had at least a mandatory requirement for all teachers to teach some sort of Aboriginal perspectives in their classrooms. And for some units, for example, music, we've had entire compulsory topics being created where all students have to experience Australian music, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists. So these are important things to remember, in that when we are becoming teachers of these curricula, we are also responsible for the delivery of mandatory and of content that is outlined clearly in our syllabuses, that is supposed to articulate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. And of course, PDHPE is another syllabus very, very strongly embedded in health, statistics, and how to improve health. So these are just a couple of examples. And then I'm just going to talk very quickly about anybody who undertook an undergraduate degree here at Western Sydney University. Every single learning guide since 2010 has made statements about you guys exiting your undergraduate degrees with a competency in terms of the Aboriginal graduate attributes. And of course, we can discuss these a little bit in our tutorials this week. So, how am I going to help you understand and unlearn what it is you think you've learnt about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? So this is one way in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people see the world. And it comes from three spheres: the human world, the physical world, and the sacred world. Each one of those spheres has another connection. So, for example, my physical world attachment is to animals and my totemic responsibility to black cockatoo. But I also have responsibility to trees that are associated with the nesting requirements of black cockatoo, the sun, moon and star requirements in terms of where they are located at certain times of the year, etc. They also have a strong sacred world attachment to the stories about black cockatoo. My then connections to increased care for country, particularly care for country related to my totemic responsibilities, but also to my family or human responsibility, because we have to have responsibilities in terms of feeding our communities, but also then in our human world sphere, we have family relationships, rules and behaviours that we have, not only about who we can marry and who we can't marry, around secrecy, but also around elders and what is expected, who eats first. All of those things become part of my human world activities and how I relate to, in my instance, my 52 first cousins who are brothers and sisters, and my 13 aunts and uncles who are my mothers and fathers. So it's a very much more complex understanding. And of course, we are not in this unit going to be going into any of those complexities in any detail. But I do want you to understand that it is a very complex world that many Aboriginal people live in, and that these are different things. These are very difficult things for young people to navigate on their own. I also want to talk about the role of yarning and the narrative. Of course, we're going to be using lots of narratives in the views sites. I will be linking in quite a lot of YouTube videos, purely because in COVID times I cannot organise for Aboriginal elders to be talking on technology, because many of them don't even own the technology. So I'm going to, in this online environment, have to try and fill your cups with YouTube that's interesting and engaging for you. But it all has a specific purpose and a specific audience, so much of the narratives that we share with you are around those three spheres, about how we see and view country, how we view families and relationships, etc. In this unit, of course, there are going to be a significant focus in the second half of the unit on pedagogical approaches used in delivery of content. And one of those major focuses that we will be looking at is 8 Ways of Learning, which was developed from the Department of Education, but came out of the work of the PhD work of Tyson Yunkaporta. When we look at these narratives and we look at things like 8 Ways, again, it will be unlearning and relearning much of what you've already previously thought you knew about communities. And of course, then we get to the quite complex issues around identity. And one of the challenges is that historically, since about 1890, we've had no less than 67 classifications of descriptions or definitions about who is and who is not an Aboriginal person. And this is quite complex because there are two groups of people, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. We are very different and distinct groups. There are 200 languages and 600 dialects. And so the classifications and descriptions in terms of non-Indigenous worldview have been very complex for us to also navigate, in that those 67 classifications via government and policy have made it very difficult for many of the more recent young people to understand their place and their Aboriginality because of historical trauma, and where they fit in. And this is particularly one of the things that our Aboriginal young people of Western Sydney really struggle with. And so these kinds of things are really important to understand deeply, particularly as many of you are going to embark on careers or already teaching in many of these settings. And so can I recommend that if you are already, and if you haven't thought about it, you access this document by Yamanouchi, Yuriko Yamanouchi, Kinships, Organisations and Wannabes, and it's particularly pertinent to our Western Sydney and Southwestern Sydney challenges that our Aboriginal young people face, in that they don't know who they are, they don't know their language groups, and what are the sorts of experiences local elders and school communities can help in facilitating identity for those young people. Another way in which we can look at the work that we just looked at in terms of the boomerang model is, what is it that we need from Indigenous knowledge systems and our Western knowledge systems to create classroom and cultural competencies? And so what are the specific formal and informal knowledges that you as beginning teachers are requiring to help support you to be great practitioners moving forward? So what do I need to do particularly to meet that cultural competency area and set myself up for success in this unit? I need you to read as much as you can in terms of understanding Indigenous knowledge systems or Indigenous worldviews, trying to make good notes each week on your lectures, your current media that you've watched, the videos that are provided on Views, so that you can pull those big ideas together for yourselves, making sure that you begin task one early and create good habits. Make sure that you begin reading, particularly for your task one, but also for your task two, and collecting materials from as many reputable sites, remembering that particularly what happens in this unit is that you do the unit, you forget to download things, and then you go off to your careers and you wish that you had downloaded everything that I perhaps had provided for you. We're going to use particularly a lot of story sharing, and this one is to understand Mussolini Harvey's work, and he's from right up on the top of the Gulf of Carpentaria. And the 8-way symbol for story sharing is the boomerang, which is in the top right-hand side corner of the slide. And you'll often see my big visual cue of what part of 8 ways learning this is related to by the symbol that I place on the PowerPoint slides. And this story by Mussolini Harvey also talks about the dreamings are our ancestors, you know, that they are fish, birds, men, animals, women totems, you know, wind or rain, whatever those totems are. But they also make that law. And if you go back to that earlier diagram, you'll see the connections. And law all has ceremony and song, and that's also part of that physical world and sphere one. And all of these things are a different worldview to the worldview that other religious or spiritual groups have. But in his community, instead of calling the story sharing Didiri, they call it Adiri. So language words change over the various communities that are also being shared with us. So if I look at Didiri, deeply to story is the key connection. And not just from one context that we unpack these things from a Western way of knowing, but we have to look at it from an Aboriginal way of knowing. And these are very important concepts. And hopefully you will play this YouTube video, which will be linked in on the Views site, and listen to Miriam Rose and Wamara around what it is to listen deeply. This is one of the things that I work with our Aboriginal young people when I work in the Territory. So I've also taught in the Territory, and we use Didiri and we use circles on a regular basis, and we try to listen to our country, to listen to the birds, to the stories, to what the land is telling us, what the wind, the rain, everything is sharing with us about what will happen next. And once we look at the video from Miriam Rose and Mara Bullman, you'll understand what I mean by looking through the world at through a different lens. So hopefully we might be able to see some connections to certain things. Finally, I want to look at what were the 3 chapters we were asked to read this week, and what are the sorts of things that we should take away from those chapters. And so chapter 3 was about delivering the promise, empowering teachers to empower students. I want us to think very clearly about our critical thinking skills and what it means to be empowering your students, remembering that you are what Bourdieu in your diversity unit and Ferreira in your diversity unit, when you looked at those 2 theorists, what were they on about? You know, the sorts of things around pedagogy of poverty, you know, empowering groups of people through education, and increasing cultural capital. So if your content knowledge is your cultural capital in terms of your curriculum areas, how deep is your cultural capital? Because it's only as how deep your cultural capital is that will be able to be empowering our students. And if you have no cultural capital in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing, or the texts, or the conceptual frameworks that are used in commerce, or in business studies, or in music, and you have, you know, limited understanding of Aboriginal history from an alternative perspective, you cannot hope to achieve success for your Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in terms of engagement, because you're limiting their critical thinking skills, but you're also limiting your own capacity to impart knowledge. So learning for a teacher is ongoing, and hopefully over time you don't see it as learning, you just see it as part of your everyday world, where you're looking at videos and things from every angle to be used in classrooms. You, of course, are also, as teachers, you become the agents for social transformation. And that requires you to have really strong core concepts in knowing your students and how they learn. So what are the key things that you need to know about students and how they learn? And many of you will have achieved some of the basics of that from your foundation unit, but you need to know more, and you then need to refine that knowledge into what are the particular aspects for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners, and if your school has a number of Pacifica kids, you need to know more pedagogies in relation to Pacifica empowerment. So these are not just things for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. I want you to think about what is your classroom demographic in Western Sydney, and what are the transformational opportunities that you need to engage with to improve learning for all students in your rooms. And the other thing is, that was brought up in the Jenny Herbert chapter, was the need to stay linked to recent research that informs your practice. And this is your standard 6. And what do you need to do in terms of professional learning? So the big questions really that you can take away from that is what makes a quality teacher? What creates fear for you about delivering the promise? And, consider from the lecture gaps that you've already recognised from your primary, your high school, your tertiary gaps, and particularly for international students, how difficult it is going to be to teach an Australian curriculum when you've had very little background knowledge to support your learning, and how much more time that might take to develop into strong opportunities for all learners. What is the role of universities in your program of study? The Herbert article raised some of those issues in terms of theory, practicum placement, content coverage. What can I engage with to support my own progress? And then I want you to think about what are the links to our Task 1 essay arguments. So making sure that you think about your essays all the time. The second chapter you were asked to look at is chapter 4. Of course, this one's much more about the actual profession and working in a placement, and who are the sorts of people that you can access, what are the sorts of other things in terms of preparation of teachers to meet the needs of professional requirements. Have you got enough theory? Do you understand? And have you got enough practicum? What are the sorts of things that you might look at? It's important to read the vignettes in the textbook. They give you some understanding of how you might reflect. The vignettes from this unit already, I've been looking at this unit and recording students' engagement with this unit for some time. And I have provided there my own vignette from a past student. And one of the things that past student reflected on was it was not just about the knowledge, values, skills, but it was also that in their professional practice PP2, they were able to go and experience one of the many opportunities Western has had in the past, which was a professional placement in Moree, so a very rural placement. So these are the sorts of opportunities post-COVID we might be able to allow students to experience again. So keep your eye out for those. If, in fact, Aboriginal education or rural education is something that you are thinking about as a professional employment opportunity post your degree. And the third chapter was that by Peter Buckskin, looking at engaging students, the important relationship between students and teachers. But it also highlighted many of the issues in the Closing the Gap report in terms of cultural competency. How do we build that cultural interface? How do we build common knowledge? What are important things that we do to develop our professional self? But particularly Uncle Peter Buckskin talks about policy in advocating cultural competency, the professional standards. Things that I take away from that particular chapter is our need to engage with the policies here specifically in New South Wales, which is the Aboriginal Ed policy and the New South Wales Connected Community Strategy. So I've put a few additional references there that might help you to undertake further reading for your essays. And one of the things that the book hasn't really highlighted, but these are the sorts of key staff you could most likely find in New South Wales schools. So the head teacher transitions and engagement is a teacher who's really there to try and facilitate all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education linkages and other linkages. There's usually one classroom teacher who's been given some workload allocation to work with staff and to improve staff, particularly in areas like HSC standards and achieving HSC, also things like retention and completions. So they're very important parts of that classroom teacher's job. There's also support for Aboriginal students in that area for completing tasks, such as homework assignments and creating relationships between homework hubs, etc. And then there's often, depending on the student numbers, a student learning support officer who's an identified Aboriginal position. There are also SLSOs, as we call them in schools, who are also non-Aboriginal identified positions, and they're there for all students. So just to keep a lookout when you do get to go to a practicum, and some of you have gone to a practicum, that these are the sorts of staff room supports that you can hope to access and create relationships with in your future teaching careers. So what do you hope to gain from this unit? They'll be one of the things that we're going to look at in our breakout rooms when we go to tutorials. But what I want you to think about is, what do you feel is essential for you to be a successful pre-service teacher in Aboriginal education settings? And what are the key concepts that your group feel, when you break it out into the groups, essential for tertiary education students undertaking an Aboriginal education program? And what are your fears? So we'll look at those things when we're in tutorials. We're also going to do an activity based on the materials from St. Luke's, looking at cards, social emotional well-being. So two things I want you to do. First of all, I must enforce buy the textbook, because you will be quite behind if you don't keep up with the readings. But the other thing is, for the tutorials, I would like you to find an image or an inspirational image from the web that you can show us in tutorial through share screen, that you can talk to about what inspires you to be a teacher. Okay, so what inspires you to be a teacher? And just lastly, these are the additional references for these kinds of areas. So what are the sorts of professional standards, your cultural competency, looking at professional learning through Aboriginal community and cultural immersion, looking at what Eitzel looked at in terms of improving the profession, and also the kinship article from Yamanouchi. I'll see you all in tutorials. There will be this on the View site for you to engage with if you have time. This is not an essential requirement. This is just to help some people do extra if they really want to. And finally, this is the link to the 3R's website, so rrr@edu.au, and that will help you understand some of the background knowledge required for knowing yourself, knowing your students, and knowing what to teach, which was today's lecture. Thank you.